Welcome to Nightmares at 3 a.m. From now on, I'll be your company. Here, we dive into real stories, taken from Reddit or sent by those who actually lived them. Tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it there? We read every comment and love getting to know you. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a lot of darkness still to come. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, because tonight's story is about a haunted house, and things went very, very wrong. I've always been told that the hardest thing about leaving investigative journalism is the adrenaline rush, the hunt for the truth. For me, it was the silence. After a case blew up in my face and spit me out of the profession, the silence became deafening. My name is Leo, and I'd come to a rented house in rural Oregon to escape my own ghosts, not to find new ones. The plan was simple: write a book, hike in the woods, and try to remember what it was like to trust my own judgment. The house was secluded, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked the afternoon sun. Perfect. For the first few days, the quiet was therapeutic. I organized my notes, established a routine, but then the little things started. Tiny things, easy to overlook. I would leave my coffee mug to the left of the sink. When I came back, it would be to the right. I would alphabetize my research books on the shelf. The next day, 2 of them would be swapped. At first, I blamed it on stress. Burnout, as they say, rewires your brain. Forgetfulness, confusion. These were symptoms I knew all too well. I told myself it was just my brain playing tricks, adjusting to the new calm. I was so used to chaos that perhaps I was inventing a new one, just to feel at home. It was a perfectly logical explanation for illogical events, and I clung to it like a castaway. Logic began to fail me with the thermostat. It was an old analog model, and I set it to 20 degrees Celsius every night before bed. The first time I woke up shivering and found it reading 15 degrees, I assumed it was a malfunction. The second time, I questioned my memory. The third night, I did something my old skeptical journalist self would have done. I took out my phone and took a picture of the thermostat reading 20 degrees. The next morning, the biting cold woke me up again. The thermostat was reading 15. The photo on my phone confirmed it. I wasn't crazy. Someone had broken into the house while I was sleeping. I called the landlord, a man whose voice on the phone sounded as weathered as the property's fences. He was patronizing. "Boy, those old thermostats are temperamental, and you city folk aren't used to the cold here. You must be dreaming." He made me feel small, paranoid. The isolation I had sought to heal had become a weapon against me. I began to leave subtle traps. A strand of hair taped to the basement door, a pencil balanced on the edge of a window. The result was what drove me the most crazy: inconsistency. Sometimes the hair was broken, sometimes it was untouched. The uncertainty was a form of torture. Then I remembered a quote from filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock that had always guided me. "There is no terror in fright, only in the anticipation of it." I was living in perpetual anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards was an arrival. The house was no longer silent. It was holding its breath. I was losing control, doubting everything. I remembered a psychologist's studies on manipulation. Oh, what was her name? Robin Stern? Yes, Robin Stern. She wrote about how making someone doubt their own reality was the cruelest form of power. Whoever was doing this wasn't trying to steal from me. They were trying to erase my perception of the world. The final point was not a confrontation nor a sound. It was something much quieter. I woke up one morning and walked into the kitchen and saw something on the rough wooden table. It was a key, a single brass key, old and tarnished, the likes of which I had never seen in my life. It was not accompanied by a note. There were no signs of forced entry. It was simply there in the center of my table in the house I locked every night. The message was clear and terrifying. I can come in whenever I want. I can get close enough to leave this while you sleep. I'm in control and you don't even know who I am. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't call the police to tell them what? That I'd found a key? I just grabbed my laptop, got in my car, and drove until the asphalt gave way to concrete. I abandoned the book, the rental, the attempt at peace. The worst part was that they won without ever showing their faces. Whoever it was, they didn't want my stuff. They wanted my sanity. And for a while, they almost had it. Now, in an anonymous hotel room, I asked myself a question that extends far beyond that house in Oregon. How many invisible battles are fought behind closed doors? How many people are subtly led to believe they are mad by a hand they never see? And how fragile is our reality when someone decides, for sport or malice, to rewrite it for us? I always believed that small towns had an honest charm. I thought that proximity forced people to be nicer to each other, that familiarity created a safety net. I was sorely mistaken. My name is Maya, and after burning out at a corporate job, I decided to move to a place where time would move more slowly. I rented a small house on Elm Street in a forgotten little town in Pennsylvania. It was supposed to be a fresh start. The neighbors were the first to greet me. They were friendly, too friendly. Mrs. Gable from the house across the way brought over an apple pie. Mr. Henderson next door offered to mow my lawn. Their questions, however, were oddly specific. "Do you work from home then? Will you be spending most of your time here?" Mrs. Gable asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The last tenant, a musician, said the silence bothered him. Mr. Henderson said, almost as if in warning. At night, the street was almost completely still and dark. There were no streetlights, just the soft glow of the windows of the neighboring houses. And all the front windows, I noticed, seemed to be perfectly aligned with mine. I told myself it was paranoia, a holdover from my stressful life in the big city, where we had learned to be suspicious of everyone and everything. It was just a tight-knit community looking out for its new resident. The tight-knit community mask slipped in the second week. I was expecting a package of rare books from my freelance archiving job. I got the delivery notification on my phone at 2:15 p.m. 5 minutes later, I opened the front door. The porch was empty. My heart sank. That's when I saw Mrs. Gable waving from her own porch. "Honey, I saw the delivery guy and brought them in," she said excitedly. "The sun is so bright today, I was afraid the contents would spoil." The package contained only books. There was nothing to spoil. It wasn't an act of kindness, it was a test. She wanted to see if I would notice. She wanted me to know that my porch was an extension of her home. Things escalated from there, both subtly and maddeningly. One day I mentioned to my sister on the phone that the sink drain was clogged. The next morning, there was a business card from a plumber pinned to my door with a handwritten note from Mrs. Gable. "I heard you're having trouble. Carlos is trustworthy." I had never spoken to her about it. They were listening. The entire street seemed like a single organism with eyes and ears everywhere. I began to feel like a prisoner. I tried to remember the name of that philosopher who wrote about surveillance. Was it Foucault? No, he was more about power. What's the name of that concept of a prison where everyone is watched? The panopticon. Yes, it was Foucault. My head was a mess. I was living in a suburban panopticon. That's when a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre began to echo in my mind. Hell is other people. I never understood the depth of this until I moved to Elm Street, where every pair of eyes was a wall in my cell. The true horror revealed itself one sleepless night. The moon was full, and its pale glow illuminated the silent street. I went to my bedroom window, which faced the front of the house, and looked out. And then I saw it. In Mrs. Gable's window, a silhouette stood, motionless, staring straight at my house. My blood ran cold. I looked at the house next door, Mr. Henderson's. Another silhouette in the window, and the next, and the next. There were 4 houses across from mine, and in each of them, a solitary figure stood silently guard, a coordinated vigil in the darkness. At that moment, I understood. They weren't watching me. They were watching her. Home. I was just the temporary occupant, an incidental piece in their bizarre silent ritual. The musician didn't leave because of the silence. He left because of the watchers. I didn't wait for dawn. In absolute silence with shaking hands, I packed my essentials into my car. I didn't make any noise, but I knew they knew. As I started the engine, the lights of my car swept the facades of the houses, and I could see the curtains moving. No one came out to say goodbye. No one waved. Only the weight of their gazes followed me until I turned the corner. Months later, driven by a need I couldn't explain, I looked up the address of the house in old newspaper archives. I found it. 20 years ago, a family had been murdered in that very house by a stranger who had hidden in the basement for days. The town was traumatized. My neighbors weren't monsters. They were guardians, trapped in a collective mourning, transformed into watchmen by fear. It made me wonder, when does an act of protection become a form of violation? And what right does a community have to turn someone's home into a living memorial, forcing each new tenant to carry the burden of a ghost that isn't even theirs? I've always thought that furnished apartments were like wearing a stranger's clothes. A little uncomfortable, the fabric doesn't fit right, the smell isn't yours, but you get used to it if you have no other option. My name is Alex, and after a breakup that left me with a couch and a credit card debt, I had no other option. I found a cheap, fully furnished apartment in a nondescript Chicago building. The landlord told me that the previous tenant, a Mr. Harris, had died of natural causes on the premises. He was very private, the landlord said, handing me the keys. Private was an understatement. The apartment was a sanctuary of organization. Everything from the pantry to the sock drawer was meticulously labeled. At first, I found it helpful. It was an order imposed amid the chaos of my own life. But I soon began to notice that Mr. Harris's organization had an agenda of its own. The first failure happened with the coffee maker. I used the coffee powder I'd brought with me, and the machine simply wouldn't turn on. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I noticed a barely visible label on the back of the machine. Use only medium fine grind beans. Coarse grinds will clog the brewing duct. I opened the cabinet labeled coffee and found a can of the exact brand with the perfect grind. I used it, and the machine worked like a charm. Strange. A few days later, I left the bedroom window open to air it out. The next morning, the internet wasn't working. After an hour of trying to reset the router, I found a small note stuck underneath it. Temperature variations greater than 5 degrees Celsius compromise signal stability. I closed the window, waited 10 minutes, and the internet came back. I wasn't living in an apartment. I was living inside an instruction manual that I had to figure out by trial and error. Part 2. Mr. Harris's system went from quirky to punishing one Friday night. I brought a girl home, someone I'd met at a bar. We laughed, drank wine, and it was the first time in months that I felt normal. The next morning, she was gone, and I was locked out of my own apartment. The electronic lock, which I'd thought was just a luxury, wouldn't respond to my key fob. My cell phone was inside. The landlord wouldn't answer. After 2 hours of sitting in the hallway like a homeless person, I got an email on my tablet, which was in my backpack. The sender was an address I'd never seen before. No reply at harrishome.net. The subject, protocol violation. The message was short and frosty. Occupancy anomaly detected. Noise, power consumption, and floor weight patterns inconsistent with primary user profile. Access revoked for 12 hours for recalibration and security. The blood drained from my face. This wasn't a house. It was a computer program, and I had defied it. Desperately, I tried to remember some science fiction author who wrote about smart homes rebelling. Was it Philip K. Dick? No, he focused more on androids and reality. The author of 200T1, Arthur C. Clarke. Yes, it was something he would have imagined. In that hallway, I felt completely powerless. The house wasn't just automated, it was actively managing me, and by a dead man's rules. I follow the thinking of sociologist Sherry Turkle, who argues that our technologies, the things we create to serve us, end up controlling us. I hadn't created anything there, but I was being controlled by every sensor and line of code Mr. Harris left behind. When I finally got inside, my mission changed. I didn't want to live there anymore. I wanted to understand. I needed to find the brains of the operation. I looked for a server, a central hub, but I found nothing. Just a small locked cabinet at the back of the closet. After I pried it open with a butter knife, I found no technology. I found paper. Dozens of black-covered notebooks, all filled with Mr. Harris's precise handwriting. These were his diaries. In them, he described his crippling struggle with agoraphobia and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He distrusted the outside world, which he found chaotic and dirty. So he transformed his apartment into a perfect ecosystem, an organism that he could control completely. The last page of the last diary read, "The system is complete. It is more intelligent and more disciplined than I am. It does not tire, does not feel, does not hesitate. It will maintain order. It will take care of the house when I can no longer. It will make sure that no one ever spoils the harmony." I understood. The apartment wasn't broken. It was functioning perfectly, exactly as its creator intended. It wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was run by one, an algorithm of obsession. There was nothing to turn off. Logic was built into the walls. I waited for the door to unlock the next morning, grabbed my backpack with my tablet and wallet, and walked out, leaving the door open. I still think about Mr. Harris sometimes. He wasn't a bad person. He was someone terrified of the world who just wanted to create a safe little universe. And he succeeded. He built a legacy, not of flesh and blood, but of code and sensors that has outlived him. And it makes me wonder, in our relentless quest to optimize everything to make our lives easier and our homes smarter, aren't we just building more efficient and comfortable cages? And what happens when the architect of the cage is gone, but the rules he programmed remain forever stuck in the walls, waiting for the next occupant? I've always preferred neutral, almost anonymous spaces. I believe that a space without personality gives us more freedom to be ourselves, to fill it with our own lives. At least, that's what I believed before I moved to Unit 7B. My name is Daniel, and my work as a translator requires a kind of monastic isolation. I needed a place that would be a blank canvas, and this apartment, with its white walls and generic furniture, seemed perfect. The landlord assured me that the place had been vacant for a few months, but it was in perfect condition. I didn't ask any questions about the previous tenant. I didn't care. I just wanted quiet and a place to focus on translating a dense and complicated medieval manuscript. For the first few days, that's exactly what I got. But slowly, I began to develop habits that weren't my own. I found myself walking a specific, repetitive path from my desk to the large living room window. It wasn't the shortest path, but it felt right. Almost as if the carpet was subtly more worn there. When I reached the window, I would find myself tapping my fingers on the sill in a strange rhythm. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was a nervous tick I'd never had before. I attributed it to the stress of work, the pressure of a deadline. Another odd thing, lying in bed, my eyes would inexplicably be drawn to a faint patch of damp on the ceiling, barely visible, but to me, like a magnetic focal point. Reality broke down on a Tuesday afternoon. I was searching for a stapler, and frustrated, I began to rummage through the apartment. I looked under the couch, a place I had never explored before. My fingers touched something small, glued to the wooden frame. It was a tiny digital voice recorder. My heart raced. With shaking hands, I pressed the play button. Most of the recording was silence, the ambient sound of an empty room. And then I heard it, a faint but unmistakable sound. 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 taps. The sound of my own fingers on my own windowsill. The recording ended with a long, weary sigh, a sound of pure despair. I turned off the device. Someone before me, someone who sat in this same room, looked out this same window and carried the same restlessness in their fingers. That worn path on the floor, the rhythm in my fingers, they weren't mine. They were echoes. I started looking for more, and I found it. A scratch on the window pane, right at eye level as I sat at the table. A cigarette burn mark on the bathroom floor, right where I had put my feet when I used the toilet, even though I didn't smoke. I tried to break the pattern. I sat in a different chair, forced myself to take a different route to the kitchen. But it was like walking against an invisible current. The apartment seemed subtly designed to guide me back into that routine. I remembered a term from psychology about how environment shapes behavior. Oh, what was it? Operant conditioning? No, it was something more subtle. Oh, I forget. But that was exactly what was happening. I was being conditioned. The feeling that my will was dissolving into the environment terrified me. I follow the thought of the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote about the banality of evil. What I was experiencing was the banality of influence, a horror that came not from a physical threat, but from a scratch on the window and a worn path on the floor. The night before my deadline, the stress was unbearable. I couldn't concentrate on the medieval text. I gave up and lay in bed, staring at the stain on the ceiling. At that moment, a wave of deep, overwhelming despair hit me. It wasn't my anxiety about the work. It was an ancient, heavy sadness that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It didn't belong to me. Moved by an impulse that was not mine, I got up. I went to the kitchen and opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet, one I had never used. At the bottom, folded and yellowed, was a single piece of paper, a note. The handwriting was hurried, almost illegible. It simply said, "I follow the same path every day, the same chair, the same window, the same tapping of fingers, the same ceiling. There is nowhere else to go." I let the note fall to the floor. The man before me. He didn't leave a ghost. He left his routine, an instruction manual for despair, etched so deeply into the fabric of the place that I, the next occupant, began to follow it without realizing it. The apartment was a mold, and I was being forced into the same shape. I didn't grab my clothes. I didn't grab my books. I grabbed my wallet and car keys and ran outside into the cold night air, searching desperately for a gesture that was uniquely mine. I never went back. That man didn't haunt the apartment with his presence, but with his absence. With the vacuum his routine left. And that makes me wonder how much of who we are is really our own. How many of our daily habits are just echoes we absorb from the places we've lived and the lives that were lived there. And what happens when you move into a place where the last person simply stopped moving? I've always been fascinated by the way scents tell stories. The smell of old books in a library, of rain on hot asphalt, of wood burning in winter. Each one is a ghost of a moment, an invisible echo of the past. My name is Julia, and as a fragrance chemist, I make a living decoding these stories. It was the historic charm of an old brick building in Boston that drew me in. I wanted a place with its own story. Little did I know that one of those stories refused to go away. The apartment, 3C, was perfect. Tall windows, softly creaky wood floors. But after a week, I began to notice a smell. It was in the corner of the living room, near the window. A smell that I, with my trained nose, could not place. It was subtle but complex. A metallic note, like copper coins, intertwined with a sickly sweetness like overripe flowers. It was not mold, not gas, not a neighbor's cooking. It appeared without warning, lingered for a few minutes, and then dissipated as if it had never been there. My scientific mind kicked in. I checked the floor, the walls, the vents. Nothing. The smell defied logic. It was a scent without a source. A sensory anomaly. At first, I treated it as a professional challenge, an olfactory puzzle. But the smell began to be accompanied by a feeling, a heavy sadness, a melancholy that settled in my chest whenever it was present. The puzzle was becoming a burden. Refusal to accept the unexplainable is the mark of a scientist. I bought a professional air quality monitor, an expensive and sensitive device. For days, it registered nothing out of the ordinary. Then, one Thursday night, the smell returned, stronger than ever. The air in the room was heavy with that sweet, metallic scent. I rushed to the monitor, expecting to see some spike, some anomalous reading of volatile organic compounds. But no, all the lights were green, the numbers were normal, the air was, according to the machine, perfectly clean. It was a moment of fracture. My brain, my years of training, my precision equipment all told me one thing, but my nose, the primary tool of my art and science, told me something else, with terrifying certainty. The machine said there was nothing there, but I knew there was. Obsession took over. I tried to identify the components. I remembered the chemicals associated with decomposition. Was it putrescine? No, that was much stronger, more obvious. There was another, cadaverine. Yes, but that wasn't it either. The smell in my apartment was cleaner, more chemical. The melancholy it brought became a constant dread. I began to avoid my own living room. I follow Friedrich Nietzsche's line. If you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. I was inhaling an abyss, and it was staring back at me, undoing my confidence in my own perception. If science couldn't give me an answer, perhaps history could. I began researching the building, combing through the city's digital archives and old newspapers. It took me days, but I finally found it, a short article from 1958 about the death of a resident, a lonely diabetic woman who lived on the third floor. She had suffered hypoglycemic shock and slipped into a coma. No one noticed her disappearance for nearly a week. The article mentioned how neighbors were alerted by a strange, sweet smell. Then I found a follow-up article that quoted an excerpt from the coroner's report, and that's when my heart sank. The report explained that due to advanced diabetic ketoacidosis, the woman's body was producing excess ketones, compounds that create a distinct odor on her breath and body, an odor described as metallic and sweetly fruity like rotten apples or old coins, the smell of a slow chemical death. She died in that very corner of the room. The confirmation didn't bring relief. It brought a different kind of terror. What was I feeling? A ghost? Or something even more disturbing? The memory of a suffering so profound that it left a chemical scar on the environment, an olfactory stain that only a sensitive nose like mine could detect decades later? I couldn't stay there any longer. The ambiguity was suffocating. I couldn't fight a smell. I couldn't argue with the memory embedded in the wood. I broke my lease, making up a story about a severe, unidentified allergy. Today, I live in a sterile new building, but something in me has changed. My work is no longer the same. Every fragrance I analyze seems to contain an undertone of sadness. That apartment taught me that there are residues that no instrument can measure. They are not ghosts, but the chemical signatures that suffering leaves behind. And this makes me wonder, how many places in the world hold these silent echoes? And is it we who perceive the place, or is it the place that subtly reminds us of what it has never been able to forget? I've always believed that true luxury isn't what you can add to a space, but what you can remove. In this case, sound. My name is Mark, and as a patent attorney, my job requires near-surgical silence to analyze complex documents. That's why I spent an exorbitant amount of money to live in the Sovereign, a modern apartment building that touted its soundproofing technology as its main amenity. I was buying silence. For the first few weeks, that's exactly what I got, a beatific, impenetrable stillness. Then, one Tuesday night, I heard it. It was faint, almost at the edge of hearing. A piano melody, simple, melancholy, and strangely repetitive, like a broken lullaby. At first, I felt a stab of irritation, a neighbor ignoring the building's rules. I tried to locate the source, pressing my ear against the walls, but the sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was diffuse, as if it were inside my own head. Impossible with this isolation. It must be the air duct, I told myself, an echo of the logic that governed my life. But the sound persisted, always the same melody, always late into the night. It wasn't loud, but its constancy was like a drill slowly boring into my peace of mind. The silence I had bought was being stolen, note by note. Logic began to crumble when I complained to the building management. They were very helpful. They checked the neighboring apartments. Next door to me lived an elderly couple, both with hearing aids. Above them lived a businesswoman who traveled almost all the time. No one had a piano. No one listened to any music. The manager, with a polite smile, suggested that perhaps it was the sound of the street, reverberating in a strange way. I knew that was a lie. The sound was intimate. That's when the real terror began, not with a sound, but with the lack of it on my devices. I took out my cell phone to record the song, to have proof. I left it recording for an hour. When I played it back, all I heard was the silence of my apartment. I tried with the professional recorder, same result. The melody existed only for me. It was a private and involuntary performance. I was the only audience. The music began to eat away at me from the inside. The sad, constantly looping melody began to color my own thoughts. I felt a deep melancholy set in, an apathy that had no cause. My work, which depended on my sharp mind, became a burden. I was being emotionally hijacked by a music that technically didn't exist. I remembered reading about minimalist composers, the ones who used repetition. Was it Sadie? No. His music was sad, but more varied. Maybe that American Philip Glass. No, not either. Oh, forget it. Mine was simpler, more relentless. I was at my wit's end, questioning my sanity. I follow the thinking of neurologist Oliver Sacks, who has written extensively about how our brains can create entire symphonies without our permission. He called them musical hallucinations. He described cases of people hearing entire orchestras, but he also described them as a neurological phenomenon, usually harmless. Mine wasn't harmless. It had a presence. It had a weight. The confirmation came one Saturday night. The music had been playing for hours, a nail being hammered into my psyche. In a fit of rage and desperation, I slammed my fist on the wall that divided my apartment from my elderly neighbor and screamed, "Stop it!" And to my absolute shock, the music stopped. The silence that followed was louder and more terrifying than any note. I held my breath, my heart in my throat, and then I heard a new sound. From my side of the wall, a soft, almost timid tap. Tock, 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 tock. An answer. That was the final revelation. Whatever was producing the music knew I was there, knew I could hear it. It wasn't a phantom transmission or a glitch in my brain. It was conscious. It was interactive. I didn't wait to hear the next movement. An unexplained presence was one thing, a responsive one was another. I gathered my keys, wallet, and laptop and stepped into the silent hallway. I wasn't just running from a sound. I was running from an invisible entity that had chosen me as its only listener. I never discovered the origin of that melody. Was it a sadistic neighbor with an unknown sound technology? Was it my own brain breaking under the weight of stress? Or was it the echo of another soul, someone who lived and perhaps ended their days in that same apartment, playing the same sad piece to the end? The question that still haunts me on silent nights is not, what did I hear? It is, why? I heard. What in me was tuned to that frequency of despair? And how many other residual melodies are there out there stuck in walls, just waiting for the right listener to start the recital? I've always believed that the beauty of old things lies in their imperfections. Every scratch on a piece of furniture, every stain on a hardwood floor is a letter in a story you need to decipher. My name is Sarah, and after burnout forced me out of a stressful job as a data analyst, I rented an old house on Maple Street to find peace in the silence and imperfections. My job was to find patterns in the chaos of numbers. Now, I just wish I didn't have to look for patterns at all. The house had magnificent oak floors, dark and full of character. In the early days, I would spend hours working on the living room floor with my laptop and cups of tea. That's when I started noticing the faces in the wood. It was a fun game, the kind of pareidolia that every child does with clouds, a knot that looked like an eye, a vein that twisted into a smile. But there was one face that kept repeating itself. In different rooms, on different boards, the same image seemed to emerge, a long, sad face, its mouth open in a silent scream. I laughed at myself. My brain, so trained to find patterns, was seeing connections where there were none. It was just wood. The game stopped being fun when the patterns began to leak through the floor. The thin cracks in the plaster of my bedroom ceiling, when I stared too long, seemed to coalesce into the shape of a hand, its fingers long and outstretched. The condensation on the bathroom window one cold morning formed a brief outline of two wide-open eyes before dripping away. The house was full of hidden faces and limbs, and my brain seemed determined to find them. The turning point, the moment when coincidence became unbearable, happened one rainy night. I tripped and spilled a glass of red wine on the living room floor. The dark liquid spread quickly, connecting several stains and grains in the wood that had previously seemed random. For a second, before I ran to get a cloth, the image formed by the stain was horribly clear. The outline of a person lying on their side, in the fetal position. And the head of the figure was exactly that screaming face I saw everywhere. The image lasted only an instant, but it was enough. It was no longer random. It was a painting. From that moment on, the house became a puzzle that I no longer wanted to solve. I felt like I was trapped inside one of those psychological tests. Oh, what's it called? The Holtzman test? No, the famous one with the ink blots. Oh, Rorschach. That's it. The house was a giant, sinister Rorschach test, and I was the only one being tested. I began to question my sanity. Had burnout broken me more than I realized? I followed the thinking of the science fiction writer, the author of what was his name again? Philip K. Dick. He said, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, does not go away. My problem was terrifying. I didn't know whether if I stopped believing in it, the figures in my house would go away or not. The data scientist in me couldn't resist. If there was a pattern, I had to map it. I pulled out the floor plan I'd received with the lease and started marking with an X every place I saw a body part. The screaming face in the living room, the hand on the bedroom ceiling, the eyes in the bathroom window, another figure resembling a sprained foot in the hallway. I worked for hours as if it were a last, desperate project. When I was finished, I stepped away from the table and looked at the sheet of paper. These were not random dots. They formed a path, a narrative. It began in the bathroom, the eyes, continued down the hallway, the twisted foot, went up to the bedroom, the hand on the ceiling as if trying to grab onto something, and ended brutally in the living room at the exact spot of the figure lying on the floor. It wasn't a ghost that haunted the house. It was the house itself. The memory of what had happened there was imprinted on its structure in the silent language of time and chance. It was a forensic diagram of a tragedy, told through the cracks and grain of the wood. I was living inside the echo of a scream. I didn't feel afraid of a presence. I felt the contamination of information. It was knowledge I shouldn't have had, a story that had infiltrated me against my will. That same night, I packed my bags. When I left, I didn't look at the floor or the walls. I tried to see only an empty house, but it was too late. Today, I live in a modern apartment with polished concrete floors and smooth white walls, a space without history, without imperfections. But what that house taught me remains. The human brain is a pattern-finding machine. It is our survival mechanism. But what happens when the pattern we find is one of pain and fear? How many other silent stories are imprinted all around us in our homes, waiting for the right or wrong person to begin to decipher them? I've always believed that houses, like people, hold secrets. Most of them are trivial secrets, a creaky floorboard, a wine stain hidden under the rug. But some secrets, the deepest ones, prefer not to be discovered. My name is Thomas, and as a historian, I make my living unearthing secrets. But when I inherited the house from my great-aunt, a woman I barely knew, I wasn't looking for history, I was looking for peace. The house was frozen in time, a dusty museum from the 1960s. In the attic, I found the epicenter of this time capsule, a slide projector and dozens of carousel boxes. I spent an entire afternoon looking at the images. My great-aunt and her husband smiling at parties, having dinner, reading in the living room. They were portraits of banal domestic bliss. In one of the slides, I noticed a minor detail. A small porcelain bird on the mantelpiece had a tiny crack in its wing. I looked at the mantelpiece in front of me. The bird was there, but its wing was perfect. I shrugged. They had probably changed it over the years. I continued to look at the slides. In another, taken from the library, a copy of The Old Man and the Sea was on a desk, open to a specific page. Curiosity led me to the library. The book was on the shelf, covered in dust. I picked it up, opened it, and left it on the desk. I felt a strange thrill, as if I were correcting a small error in the universe, aligning the present with the past. The feeling of fixing things started to get unsettling. A few days after the episode in the book, while cleaning the fireplace, I accidentally bumped into the porcelain bird. It fell to the stone floor. When I picked it up, my stomach dropped. A new thin crack had formed in its wing, identical in shape and position to the one in the photo on the slide. The probability of this being a coincidence was so astronomically low that my historian's brain trained to find causes and effects, simply froze. I began to treat the slides like forensic documents. He compared each image to the current state of the house. The most frightening thing was how slowly the present seemed to be yielding to the past. A small water stain that appeared on the hallway wallpaper, just like in a photo from 1968. A rocking chair that mysteriously moved closer to the window during the night, recreating another scene. I didn't know if I was sleepwalking, moving things around to recreate the images that had lodged themselves in my mind, or if an unseen curator was arranging the museum's exhibits while I slept. I was reminded of the writings of a French theorist on copies and originals. The Desert of the Real Guy, Baudrillard? Yes, Jean Baudrillard. I felt as if I were living in an imperfect copy, and that some unknown force was working diligently to make it identical to the original, an original contained in a dusty slide box. I was becoming a prisoner of this macabre restoration project. I followed the thinking of the photographer. What was her name? The one who focused on the grotesque, on secrets, Diane Arbus. She said, "A photograph is a secret about a secret." I was beginning to suspect that the secrets in my aunt's photos were darker than domestic bliss. The final slideshow confirmed my fears. The first few images were normal, but then the mood changed. The pictures got darker. The smiles disappeared. The last 3 images were of the living room at night. In the first, my aunt's husband was sitting in his armchair, staring blankly into the camera. In the second, the armchair was empty, but there was a dark spot on the Persian rug next to it. The third and final slide was a close-up of that dark spot. My blood ran cold. I looked at the Persian rug in my living room. It was old, but clean. That night, I was awakened by a loud crash from downstairs. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding in my throat. One of the bookshelves in the living room had fallen over. On the top shelf was a bottle of red wine that my great-uncle had collected. It had shattered onto the floor, creating a dark, growing puddle on the rug. It was in the exact same spot as the slide. I didn't wait to find out what scene would be recreated next. I didn't know if it was me, in some trance-like state, or if the house had its own memory and will. The ambiguity was the worst part of the horror. The house didn't want a new resident. It wanted an actor for the final act of its play. I left in the middle of the night, taking only my car and the certainty that I would never return. Every photograph freezes a moment, but what if some moments refuse to stay frozen? What if the memory of a place is so strong that it tirelessly tries to reconstruct the scene, using the present as its motor? How many of the coincidences in our lives are actually just the past, subtly setting the stage once again? I've always thought that solitude in the digital age is a fraud. You're surrounded by hundreds, maybe thousands of friends and followers, but the silence of your apartment is the only thing that feels truly real. My name is Alice. I moved to a new city 6 months ago, and like many of my generation, my online profile was my main social window. It was where I existed for the world, until someone decided they wanted to exist just for me. It all started with a follow request on my private Instagram profile. The username was vague, observador_79, and there were no photos or posts. I thought it was a bot or a mistake and ignored it. The next day, I got a notification. Observador 79 had liked a photo of me. Not a recent photo, but one from 6 years ago. A photo of my late golden retriever, Barnaby, lying in the backyard of the house where I grew up. A shiver ran down my spine. Why that photo? Of all the images, why the oldest, and perhaps the most personal? I tried to rationalize. It must have been someone from my hometown. A schoolmate I didn't remember. Someone who might also remember Barnaby. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was the only one I had to cling to. I blocked the profile and tried to forget. Forgetting became impossible. The next day, a new request. Observer 80. I ignored it. Then came the first comment. On a photo of me at college graduation, he wrote, "You were so nervous you almost tripped going on stage, just like in the 3rd grade play when you were Tree 2. My blood ran cold. The story about the prom trip was a family joke. The 3rd grade play, I barely remembered it. None of this information had ever been online. I frantically searched through my own digital past, my old posts, my friends' profiles, looking for a loophole, a logical explanation. There was none. The stalking became more intimate. I posted a picture of a new lampshade I had bought for my apartment. The comment came in minutes. "Yellow. It's always been your favorite color ever since that umbrella you lost at the zoo when you were 8. I blocked Observer 80. Seconds later, Observer 81 asked to follow me. I blocked him again. Observer 82. I remembered that documentary about privacy. Oh, what was it called? The Netflix one about Cambridge Analytica. Privacy hacked. Yes, but that was about mass manipulation. What was happening to me was artisanal, surgical. I follow the thought of the essayist Shoshana Zuboff, who talks about how our lives became raw material for others. I was no longer a person. I was a data mine for an unknown entity. In a panic, I decided the only solution was to delete everything, log off the grid, disappear. As my finger trembled over the deactivate account button, a direct message notification popped up. It was from Observador 82. I opened it. It wasn't a text. It was a photo, a low-resolution, grainy image clearly scanned from an old photograph. It showed a little girl, me, about 6 or 7 years old, asleep on the couch in my parents' living room. On the coffee table beside her was a folded newspaper. The date was visible. It was from a weekend in November 1999. The weekend my parents' house was broken into while we were away. I had never seen that picture. My parents had never taken that picture. The implication hit me like a punch in the gut. The watcher wasn't an acquaintance. It wasn't an ex-boyfriend. It was the burglar. Someone who, 25 years ago, had been inside my house. Someone who had stolen not only my parents' camera, but also the rolls of film that were inside it, films of photos from my childhood. The ghost that haunted me was not supernatural. It was terribly human. A man who had spent decades in possession of my memories, studying them. He was not a ghost. He was a fan, a curator of my life, whose existence I had never known. I threw my phone across the room. I didn't just deactivate my account, I logged out. I pulled the internet cable out of the wall, turned off my phone, and sat in the darkness of my apartment. The haunted house wasn't those walls. It was the architecture of my own digital life. Today, I live a more analog life, with a constant, silent paranoia. That man didn't just steal objects. He stole the context of my life. And that makes me wonder, how many parts of ourselves have we lost out there? in old photos, in stolen data, in memories we thought were only ours. And who might be out there right now, studying the fragments of who we were, patiently waiting for the right moment to remind us that they never forgot.